Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, October 21st, and we will hear the presentation, Zoning for Equity, Resiliency, and a Post-Pandemic World. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. I will do my best to answer those technical questions. For your questions related to the presentation, again, just type them in the questions box. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association. So thank you to the Ohio chapter and for our panelists for joining us today. If you head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast, you can register for all of our upcoming sessions. We have one session left for October, and we're actually fully booked for all of our Fridays through the end of the year. And just as a note, we will have another law session available if you need it. That will probably take place sometime in December, and it will probably be on a Wednesday or a Thursday. So if you need those credits, don't worry, we've got you covered. Again, head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. We'll be posting that information up shortly. And again, you can register for all of our webcasts by heading over to that page. So this session has been approved for 1.5 AICP CM credits and 1 equity credit. To log those CM credits, head over to planning.org and log into your My APA account. From there, you can search either by today's title or event number, again, both of which can be found on our website. So if you forget or are having trouble, head over to our website for more information to help you search for today's CMs. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and I also send out weekly reminders of the upcoming Friday session. And be sure to head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. We record all of our sessions and we post them up there. If you just search Planning Webcast, we'll pop up on YouTube, along with our well over 400 recordings. So be sure to subscribe so that you get notified when our sessions are loaded up onto our channel. So again, as a quick reminder, we are recording the session, we'll have it on our YouTube channel, and if you have any questions, either technical questions or questions for our panelists, type them in the questions box and we'll get to those at the end during the Q&A. So that's it for my housekeeping. I'm going to turn it over to Jocelyn and Sean to introduce themselves and to kick things off. So Jocelyn, I'm turning those controls over to you now.
All right, sounds good.
Great. Can you see our screen?
It looks perfect. Thank you.
All right.
Great, lovely.
Well, hello everyone, and happy Friday afternoon. I hope you are nourished after lunch or eating lunch now, and hopefully you'll stay awake for the next hour and a half. We'll try to help you. I'm Sean Suter. Yeah, we try to make zoning fun. I'm Sean Suter, lead principal and founder of ZoneCo. And with me?
My name is Jocelyn Gibson. I am a senior planner with ZoneCo also.
And we are a law and planning firm who focuses on zoning codes, hence the name ZoneCo. So we work on zoning codes across the United States. We've worked in 17 states across the country, with new states being added all the time. And we craft clear, consistent, user-friendly, equitable, and defensible zoning codes because, as you all know, zoning codes are none of those things. So we try to, a lot of zoning codes are none of those things, or not most of those things. So we try to assist communities in making them reflect and advance the vision of the community. And equity is a big part of what we're working on. And we'll be talking about a number of things today. But one thing, Jocelyn, that I've noticed at APA recently when we're going to conferences is that zoning is a hot topic. It used to be that you couldn't find anybody to come to a zoning session, and then folks stopped booking zoning sessions because they weren't popular. And now it's standing room only because I think so many communities are frustrated with their zoning codes, are seeing the effects of inequitable unclear, inconsistent, exclusionary, overly cumbersome zoning codes that have not been updated or have been piecemeal updated for decades. So it's a hot topic, and we love being part of the solution. And today we'll talk about.
Yep. So our firm has been thinking critically about what we can do better to bring equity into zoning codes. We are still learning, like everybody else. I think that there's a great deal of scholarship that still needs to be done. We're not good in the field of zoning at studying the implications of our work, and I think that's very important moving forward. So we are still learning when it comes to integrating equity within our work, but we put a lot of effort and time into thinking about how we can do these things better. And so we would like to share that with you today. I feel we've taken steps to try to be better. We also want to talk about ways that a zoning code can foster resiliency, more sustainability within zoning codes. We also have some resources that we'll be sharing with you. If you are considering an update to your zoning code, places you can go that have a really good repository of information for that update when it comes to resiliency and sustainability. We're going to talk a little bit about how COVID has changed our work. We have seen some different things from our clients and communities on what they're looking for in a post-pandemic world, things that have changed, that are more important to them now. So we'll be sharing some of those things with you. And we'll also be sharing some of our thoughts, some things we've learned, and some of our reading on long-range plans vis-a-vis zoning. In our work, we tend to start work after other planners have come in and finished a comprehensive plan. So we usually follow the plan, and we are supposed to be our work is the implementation of that plan. So we are just sharing that from our perspective. And then that will be followed by Q&A. The last 30 minutes or so of the presentation will be Q&A. So if you have any questions, make sure to type them in, and we will get to them all at the end. So please feel free to ask questions.
That's really the fun part. Because all of this is a discussion and a conversation that we all need to be having. So we recognize that zoning has contributed inequity in both social and racial economic inequity for a long time. And so the question we have to ask ourselves anytime we're looking at a zoning code, doing a diagnostic of an existing zoning code as it relates to the community's vision is, whose vision is it that is promoting? Who's been making the zoning decisions? Who decides what the use table says? And typically we know that has been majority groups in most communities, the same people that come to all the meetings, and it tends to be a singular voice that is making those determinations. And so the first thing we have to look at is who's at the table. And we all are striving for great community engagement and to achieve or to get feedback and input from the broadest audience possible. But we've not done a great job of that because it takes a lot of work, and it is hard work, and you have to be very deliberate about it. And so a lot of times we fall short, and we know that. So, you know, this zoning thing that we're doing is a 100-year experiment, really, in America. It's been something that really originated here in the early 20th century and has shaped land use only for about 100 years of human history on this earth. And so we're still learning how to deal with land use regulation. And I think one thing that we've learned is it can be used for good and it can be used for evil, right? So we have to unpack those assumptions that are baked into these documents. And I think that's something that if you're going to do a zoning diagnostic, you have to look read between the lines and unpack, you know, why was that decision made? Why are we doing what we're doing, right? If we're not able to answer that question, if you can't read every provision of your zoning code and answer the question of why are we doing what we're doing, and it doesn't promote a public health, safety, or welfare of the community, then it really shouldn't be in there. And then the question is, you know, of the whole community, not one particular loud voice in the community. Single-family land uses contribute to probably the largest largest land use of our community in our communities. That has been determined to be the gold standard of land use, and so we need to take a look at that. But beyond that, single use zoning is an American experiment. We talk about that a lot, and that throughout human history, we've never lived in single-use buildings. We've always lived in mixed-use buildings and communities until the automobile really allowed us to separate land uses by distance, and to drive between, I live in a house, I work in an office building, I shop at a grocery store, that's connected by cars typically. And that, we know that experiment will have worked very well and has not achieved equitable ends. And we always say the best way to determine whether something is working, whether our system of zoning is working, is to look around at the built environment, at your community. Is it a community that's segregated? Is it a community that has a lot of vacancies? Is the land use system working? And if not, it's time to throw it out and start over.
So, we have been, critically thinking about the services we provide and the zoning codes we write. And, I think those of us that work with zoning and planning, we've long known the issues. And I think that we've all been reflecting over these past 2 years. And I think it's just people, I think, as Sean said in the beginning, zoning is more of a sort of hot topic because we're all so much more aware of how problematic it has been, all the problematic things it has perpetuated. So,
and we're now talking about these issues though openly, and we're recognizing that there is a problem. Obviously, that's the first step in coming up with a solution.
Right.
So I think at least many people are, and I hope you all are as well. And I'm sure you see it in your day-to-day work in your communities. So what are some of the solutions, and how do we identify first what the problems are, Jocelyn, and then come up with solutions?
Right. So, for us, we felt like we're people who stare at zoning codes every day, but we are limited by our own experiences. So we convened what we call the Equity Zoning Advisory Committee, and we had maybe a handful of meetings, a few meetings with them, and they were professionals from around the country that all have zoning as part of their work. They're equity oriented, and zoning is a facet of their work. So they came at it from different angles, even though they all know zoning. There's some of our EZAC members were housing professionals, some are mobility professionals focusing on equity and mobility, minority businesses and planning, business districts for minority-owned businesses, economic development representative, and then someone that had written a comprehensive plan followed by equity-oriented zoning reform. So we all convened as a group and talked, and I think, because you stare at a zoning code every day, you think that you know all there is to know, but we did learn a lot through that process of just about how culturally prescriptive a zoning code is, especially if you look at the use table. That really dictates what's allowed in a community and who makes those decisions, who has historically always made those decisions. So we really, it was a really reflective process, and we genuinely learned a lot through it. So, what did we learn? Like I was just talking about, underlying assumptions in a zoning code. Once you start peeling back, they're kind of weaved throughout an entire zoning code. It's not just that the housing types we permit and where. It's really throughout the entire zoning code that you start to see these things when you're attuned to it.
One of the underlying assumptions that we see in almost all zoning codes is single family is the highest and best land use. It is the gold standard in American housing, or at least that's the policy that's been perpetuated in these codes. And we know that there are many different housing types. People have many different desires for different types of housing, and single family is not the only one. And so why have we allowed ourselves to regulate in a way that single family zone is the dominant land use, single family gets all the protections, multifamily is usually cast aside to some either very urban downtown location or off on a highway, off an interstate? Or I was just in Maryland, in the Baltimore area last weekend, and I couldn't believe it. They're building 400 apartment units overlooking a landfill. And those are the kind of places, luxury apartments with a view of a landfill. Those are the places that the zoning code has allowed multifamily. So the assumptions that we're talking about are single family is good, multifamily is a nuisance use. It's equivalent to an industrial use. And so let's put it over there by the interstate. Let's put it over there by the landfill. Let's put it over in a place where we don't, where the whatever externalities we assign to it can be addressed. I think that's one assumption. There are many others.
And we didn't talk. We've got some books at the end to show for if you're looking at history of zoning, and it's really imbued in the history from, I think in Euclid versus State of Ohio, one of the lower court decisions talked about how this Euclidean zoning would essentially create a segregationist system if you look back at that court case. So it's really from the outset, and everything is so entrenched now that we really need to rethink it.
Well, another assumption that we see is that use is the most important determiner of land use decisions, and we know that that's not necessarily true either. You look at form-based codes, that the form of the built environment is as important, if not more important, than the use in some instances. So another underlying assumption is that everything is going to be accessed by car, or that we need to provide significant space to house and park cars.
Everyone will have a car.
And that everyone will have a car, right? And that the public realm can't handle the vehicular demand, and therefore we need to shift the burden over to the private property owner. That's what our zoning codes with minimum off-street parking requirements are doing. And that assumption is we don't have enough parking in the public realm, we have to shift that burden. Why do we assume that when we haven't done a study? Why are we still assuming that 50 years after the ordinance was written?
Right, and so another thing we learn is just the lack of diverse voices, and we see this in a lot of communities where we go, and this is sort of entrenched throughout the process. It's not just engagement. We all know that engagement, it's high average age. They're very white spaces in any kind of planning process, any kind of planning commission meeting often. And so that needs to change. And something that I say is when we go into communities, engagement is always part of the process. But I don't know that we are necessarily, that zoning and planning professionals are necessarily always going to be the right people to do engagement. I think that's something we have to think about critically. In our project in Evanston, Illinois, we did an initial zoning assessment, and they applied for grants, $100,000 in grants to actually pay the community members that were working with people who were challenged in finding housing, working with people who are experiencing houselessness, working with people with disabilities, working with minority communities, and they were able to pay those people, pay those groups to engage with their constituents and the people that they were interacting with, and they were the people who were best able to do that. So think about engagement differently, and think about who needs to be at the table, and think about that from the inception of your RFP, that you need to be thinking about diverse voices from that moment, before you even take steps to start writing your zoning code. Think about those parties, and I think it's important to compensate them for their time. They're already dealing in a high need situation in the middle of a housing crisis. I think the compensation piece is important. So in Evanston, Illinois, I have to give a lot of credit to the housing organization that hired us, because they took, they are doing this broad engagement process that I feel is exactly the appropriate thing to do, and they're discovering a lot, and I hope we start to see more of that. And so the last point, what we learned is that planners must be advocates. I think for a long time I think the planning profession in this country, it's maybe different than other countries. There's maybe some of these topics are a little more fraught. I don't know if it's fair to say that, but planners must be advocates for these things. It's in the AICP Code of Ethics, and it's got to be a priority moving forward. And I hope it is for the profession broadly.
And one question we always ask is, do you in your community have a portion of your community that is never at the table? that is rarely at the table or that is marginalized in some way? Where do we live? Where do they live generally? And how do we engage with them? How do we access them? In one community we're working in, they have a large Spanish-speaking population. And we've made it very clear that we will have a translator with us at all of our engagement sessions so that it's welcoming to people whose English, who speak English as a second language. Lots you can do there, but it has to be intentional. That's the real key. As Jocelyn said, making it worth people's time, but also connecting up how any of this impacts their daily life. And so we leave out of the process a lot renters. We always focus on property owners. They're the ones that get noticed. They're the ones that show up because they have this big investment, right? But renters are invested in the community as well. They live there, they may work there, they participate. They're also spending money in the community. And we do, I think, a very poor job of trying to engage with them. And so that's something that we have tried to be more intentional about as well, not just engaging with the same old people. One thing that we've done is to help identify these issues, because like I said, you can't really know what the cure is until you identify the illness. And so the equity zoning diagnostic is something that more and more communities are asking us to do as part of our zoning code rewrite projects. And that is to determine where the zoning code is advancing equitable outcomes, whether it's social, racial, economic, or whether it is creating friction or in some instances serving a barrier to achieving the equity that the community desires. And we really conceived this concept when we were looking at comprehensive plans. And almost everybody's comprehensive plan talks about some sort of equity, whether it's equitable housing or racial equity, but that is something most communities strive for. And what we found was that the zoning codes did not reflect the regulations, the laws did not reflect that desire and could not and was not implementing that desire, therefore. So you can't, the law is where the rubber meets the road on this stuff. You can plan, and planning is important, and it's important to have ideals, but those have to be translated into laws, or at least your laws need to get out of the way of achieving it. And so Jocelyn has been working on an equity zoning diagnostic in Evanston, which has been a great project. They're also doing, and she'll talk more about that, a really great work in Louisville. We haven't been part of it. It's not something our firm's done, but we've talked with Louisville about the work they're doing down there around racial equity in particular. So many communities are starting to look at this as part of their zoning diagnostic, which traditionally has been about economic development or land use or housing, which is all part of equity, but not focused on going through each section of the zoning code and saying, how is this advancing equitable outcomes for our citizens?
In Evanston, like I said, we're contracted by a housing organization, and they're doing excellent work on this project as well. They get a ton of credit. We didn't have a methodology going in. We just looked at every section of their code, every line of code, just to see what we were finding after we'd gone through the process of learning from our equity zoning advisory committee, trying to educate ourselves. We just looked at it whole scale, and it wasn't, like I said earlier in this presentation, we were looking at procedures, administration, standards, and we could really see, throughout a lot of that code. And I would like to say Evanston is no different. We see this in the codes everywhere we work. So I do not want to call it this community because these issues are really everywhere. In doing this analysis, there were 3 areas where we categorized the problems that we were seeing, and one was policy. So as you know, your zoning code should be the implementation of your comprehensive plan. Also, any other long-range plans that you're doing should be reflected in your zoning code. So when we say things like maintain existing character, if we've had exclusionary zoning since the inception of zoning in a community, and we say we want to maintain the character, what are we saying? And so when I say policy, it's how, there's a purpose and intent statement at the beginning of every district, beginning of every code. What policies are they pointing to? And what does that look like when your housing study and your housing strategy says we need to integrate housing options in every neighborhood, in every part of this community? Is that being carried forward in your zoning? And so just identifying that gap, I think, is a first thing that we were starting to see. Procedures where you have subjective review processes. This is one thing you can analyze, is you can look at planning approvals and planning decisions. Are they discriminating against certain project types? And you will quickly see that if that is occurring. Additional conditions always apply that are over and above what other types of projects, if it's a more affordable housing type, or you can see trends there. So looking at your subjective review processes. Also, even just looking at the composition of our planning bodies, we'll have a developer on site, as we should, but do we have a housing advocate? Who is making up these boards? Is it representative of the community? Looking at that really critically. And also the standards. I think the standards are where we find, there is a lot to unpack there in the way that we've built a lot of zoning standards that create economic exclusion and racial exclusion and segregation. So, we're going to get into some of those standards in a little bit. This was a really open-ended process for this first diagnostic, and we're trying to look at ways that we can condense it for communities that want to do this in a way, communities that want to do this generally in a way that they can integrate into their existing work. So we've already gotten into this a little bit. We wanted to get a little bit into the specifics of zoning amendments that you can pursue. Obviously,
talk about the architectural review notes. I think that was really powerful.
Well, I don't exactly know the reason. I think the design and planning review body was dissolved, but I don't know the backstory. This is after we had made recommendations to critically review, as we would in any other community, critically review the decisions being made. But I know that
a lot of times the architectural review committee or board, design review board, is adding time and expense and cost, time and expense and to these projects, requiring additional professionals to be hired, or adding conditions to projects that are making them more expensive. Now, it's great if they're increasing the quality, or if you're in a historic district or you need that particular architecture. But in many cases, it's just adding to the regulatory risk and the cost of developing in a community. And in some cases, that is making it prohibitive to increase the amount of affordable housing. It's just driving up the price of the project, but it's driving up the rents, which is going to make the project less affordable. So the question is, how do we balance that?
Yeah, and something we hear a lot is comments. Within the floor, when the floor is open for comments, decision makers saying things like, well, I don't think people are going to want to live in a unit this small, or I don't think that this is how someone wants to live. About certain types of housing, people don't want townhouses, and that's really problematic in imposing, when those sort of subjective assessments are made. I think there's no place for them in, I think we know what kinds of housing types are lacking. So
a lot of it needs to be driven by data, and rarely are these decisions made based on data. So what is the demand? How much supply do we actually have? Is it actually oversupplied, or is it undersupplied? A lot of questions like that need to be answered with data and decisions made better on that. It makes it more objective and less subjective. Also, very clear standards. If you're going to have design standards, make them right-sized to the affordability of the community. If you're looking for more affordable housing, then don't impose really strict high-style architectural standards on your project. Basic stuff like that, it's pretty obvious, but a lot of times these things are baked into the zoning codes, and then nobody ever wants to change it, and it just continues to proliferate and create these issues. These are things that are easily identifiable. let's see here. What else? All right.
So we've got, I think we've covered everything except for in complaint-based enforcement. Many enforcement departments in many cities, don't have as much capacity as maybe they should. And so this isn't necessarily always a product of discriminatory practices, but with complaint-based enforcement, I think we can all see how that would be problematic, and just sort of critically assessing how that's working with enforcement. In communities that there is a means to help address the violation as well, not just that the violation is strictly punitive, that if someone wants to rectify the issue, maybe doesn't have the means, that there are programs in place to assist with that.
This is housing diversity is something that we see in every comp plan. We want a diversity of housing options, a continuum of housing options, aging in place, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have zoning codes that focus on single family or that emphasize single family as the highest order of housing, that makes it hard, right? And so relegates usually other types of housing, whether it be two-family or multifamily or townhouses, to either, like I said earlier, very urban places or areas where, like next to the landfill or next to the industrial area or next to the interstate, places where people will tolerate those uses, is doing a disservice to that goal of achieving housing diversity and a continuum of housing options. And so that's probably the number one place where we're seeing this. Density maximums are another. We only in our community allow 8 dwelling units per acre. We see this a lot, or 4. That's not any kind of density that's going to get you additional housing. It's going to increase your supply or help with your affordability issue, right? So if we need additional housing, we're going to have to go up in density. Well, what's the right density number? We can pull numbers out of the air, but those are arbitrary. These numbers that we put in zoning codes have to be based on housing studies. What is the demand? What is the supply? And how do we come up with a density that is going to help us achieve the desired number of units in our community? I think in planning, we have to start thinking that way. We have X number of parcels available, or land available, and if we apply the density maximums to it at the number that's currently in the code, how many units are we going to actually be able to achieve? How many do we need? And what are we going to do about that shortfall? We're going to push it off on the community next door? Are we going to accept the responsibility and try to figure out how to incorporate it into our community? So data-driven decision-making about zoning standards, I think, is really, really important. And that's the same with parking. We hear everywhere about there's not enough parking because, Friday night, I can't get a parking spot in front of my favorite restaurant. Well, it doesn't mean there's not enough parking. Some people say there's a walking problem, not a parking problem, right? You can maybe walk a couple blocks. People are not generally inclined to do that, but the data is what's important. We need to do a parking demand analysis, a parking supply analysis. And we need to focus on supply and demand in order to make these decisions about these standards. And so we're doing that in more and more places. In fact, when it comes to minimum off-street parking requirements, I'm simply not, what I've been telling my clients is you have to do that parking analysis. I'm not going to pull numbers out of the air like we've been doing in planning and zoning for the last 50 years. I'm not going to say, oh, 1 parking space per 400 square feet. I mean, that was based on a building code a lot of times, or occupancy loads, things like that. But frankly, none of us really know what the right answer is,
Yeah, and it's especially, with housing. We know, I hope everyone's read, a really great book is The High Cost of Free Parking. But, if you're people that don't own an automobile, they're essentially, we require it for everything. They're essentially absorbing the cost for everybody else, even when they don't own a car. And so, there are definitely some equity implications there. You know, it's speaking to your point about it being arbitrary, you know, for a lot of industrial uses, you know, what's that number look like? You know, I think there's a lot of arguments from both the residential side and the commercial side for letting, we're not removing the off-street parking because it will probably still be constructed in the environment we're in our current context, but I think there's a lot of arguments for removing parking minimums, which essentially is just removing the arbitrary nature of the parking minimums we've always been promoting through zoning codes.
Well, and shifting the burden back to the public. You know, the only reason we have off-street parking minimums is because the public realm was overloaded, was overcrowded, so we had to shift that burden on the private property owners to provide parking. That is not the case in most places. There's usually ample public parking in many places, on-street parking. Yet the on-street parking goes unused because there's so much off-street parking. That doesn't make any sense. That's another assumption that has been carried forward in these codes. That, you know, that may be exactly correct. Maybe the public realm is overloaded, and there's no more capacity. And you do have to shift that burden on the private property in your community. But you have to take a look at that. It's not one size fits all across America. Every community is not the same. That's how we've been treating zoning for so long. Another one is accessory dwelling units. You know, that's a hot button issue in most communities. And that's another housing option that allows people to, in some instances, make an income on their property and allows them to stay on their property, or to house a family member, or for people for their kids to come back and live in the community, or for them to age in place. There's so many things that either an integrated or a separate accessory dwelling unit can do to promote diversity of housing options that might outweigh some of the discomfort people have with it, or the perceived impacts, negative and adverse impacts of it. So all of this, you know, anything that's adding a burden to someone, both financially or access to something, is creating inequity. And we have to look at it and say, you know, is the trade-off worth it? Is the public health, safety, and welfare that we're trying to promote, you know, is that what we're trying to do here? And what impacts is it having on the community as a whole? Environmental justice, that's another one. You know, a lot of times, like I said, multifamily was put next to industrial zones or on highways. Nobody wants to live on the side of an interstate highway or next to a factory or overlooking a trash dump. You know, so these are decisions that are made by people who don't live there in a lot of cases. And so that's an environmental justice issue. So just looking at your maps, looking at where things are zoned, looking at your standards, removing unnecessary burdens, not just on homeowners or renters and the residential side of things, but on businesses. You know, a lot of these zoning codes are written for chain businesses or big corporate companies that need so much parking or have a certain development typology. But what about the small business? Why should the small business owner have to, you know, shoulder the burden of a huge parking lot if they don't need it, just because the zoning is set up for big business?
Yeah, after recently speaking with the community about how commercial zoning standards can also be exclusionary and favor, you know, excessively large minimum lot sizes, like, you know, excessively low lot coverage percentages, things like this. After discussing that it's very disadvantageous to the small business owner, we had a community say that they want to permit food trucks and they want to permit street vendors to just sort of like empower small business owners that are maybe coming with less capital. And so I think that this is something we need to start exploring as you know, we are just starting to explore these issues. And I think there's so much room for more research, more understanding of things we can do to just sort of claw back the zoning regulations that have very much favored wealthy, generally white, historically Americans, and then also larger businesses.
Adaptive reuse is a big issue. If your community is experiencing a lot of vacancy, you know, you have to ask yourself. Obviously, there's a market issue there. There's a supply demand issue there. But it could also be that small businesses can't start up in your community because of whatever zoning regulation is in place. Maybe the type of business isn't permitted, or maybe I want to put my restaurant in a shopping center that doesn't have enough parking based on the restaurant off-street minimums, parking minimums. Things like that. If you start peeling back the layers of the regulation, is saying, how can we eliminate some of that stuff to incentivize and make it easier for a small business to start up in our community?
And one last thing is to, on this slide before we move on, is the definition of family. There's many codes that no more than X number of unrelated adults may live in a household. We're in the middle of a housing crisis where, however people choose to form their households should be permitted. Often we find that where there is an enforcement of the definition of family in a code, it's often if there is attention being created by a university or institution where that definition of family is used to maybe many students living in a home together to sort of, but that's an enforcement issue. I don't think that we should be dictating how families live, how households live to sort of enforce some overcrowding issues. Limited overcrowding issues. So the definition of family should also be looked at critically because it can often be very exclusionary and not reflective of how modern households form, especially in the midst of a housing crisis. And so if you were looking for additional resources, these are some state regulations. And the top one is a federal affordable furthering fair housing. That was under the Obama administration, tying some HUD funding to sort of fair housing enforcement. These are all legislative efforts that you can look to. That and Desegregate Connecticut, the National Zoning Atlas is something that we've been a part of. So please do reference those and read more about them. We do have some references here for equity assessments.
Yeah, the Journal of the American Planning Association has some great stuff. Are we planning for equity? See under JAPA there. That is a really good article if you're interested in creating an equity assessment or doing an equity assessment for your community. Brookings has a ton of stuff. And then there's some other communities that are really focused on this in Minneapolis, DC, down in the Tampa area. But there are lots and lots of resources, and everybody's coming at equity from a different perspective. And sometimes it's focused on housing supply, affordability. Sometimes it's focused on racial segregation, economic segregation. There's lots of different focuses, but it's all getting to the same thing, and that is that our communities are not creating opportunities for all people to succeed. And so there are other resources. Smart Growth America has some great stuff. If you're familiar with Up for Growth, they have a really good report that just came out about housing affordability and supply. But a lot of organizations working on equity. But like I said, the rubber meets the road in the zoning code. And if your zoning code is baked with 1960s assumptions, or even modern assumptions made by people who don't have a broad perspective, then you're not going to be able to achieve the desired equity.
These are some further reading. Admittedly, I've not read How the Suburbs Were Segregated, but it has been well reviewed. But these are some additional books if you're looking for some material understanding how.
This is required reading on our shelf here at ZoneCo. Color Law, that's a great one. I'm sure as planners you've all read some of these books. They're really enlightening. Stuff you may not know, other stuff that you know, but great to reinforce the thinking and give you some ideas on how to make change.
Shifting
gears a little bit, huh?
As we promised, we codes as a tool to foster resiliency and sustainability. This is one where this is a really interdisciplinary. I think the efforts moving forward are going to be very interdisciplinary: architecture, environmental science, watershed planning. It's very interdisciplinary. We've got some resources at the end. that will be very helpful. And we are just speaking from our experience, but the resource at the end is very excellent, and I do implore you to go take a look at it.
This is an issue that, unlike equity, I think a lot of people have recognized the problem, but a lot of people still don't recognize the problem. And that is somewhat, I guess, same with equity, but even more so when it comes to climate change. So it seems like it's open for debate, even though it's hard to debate. We've when I was coming through planning school, it was all about urban sprawl and the gobbling up of green fields and cars and auto emissions and all that, and that is still obviously a huge driver of our climate crisis. But we also have some other things that are related to that, and that is the work that we're doing on the coasts relative to sea level rise. That's probably the biggest threat to our coastal areas. There's a lot of our coastal areas, and we're doing a lot of work in coastal communities to figure out how to address that. One way is to raise foundations, and FEMA's requiring raised foundations in a lot of places that have low sea level, that are 7, 8, 10 feet above sea level. These are low-lying areas, coastal areas, and so they're requiring that. But then that creates other issues. Or do we raise lots, or do we raise roads? There are so many issues around sea level rise that as planners we have to bake into our zoning codes these requirements. And then there's also, I want you to go to the next slide, I guess, maybe. I mean, certainly getting away from an auto-dependent culture is going to be key. The CO2 emissions, trying to reduce those, less, petroleum focused and dependent. And so, we see the effects of our auto dependence and our land use patterns in our air quality and in our heating of the atmosphere. We see the effects of a lot of this in our storms, our sea level rise due to hurricanes and stormwater issues. So there's ways we can address this through our zoning codes to try to help. And that's what we're also looking at. Many communities are saying, how do we address these stormwater issues without spending billions of dollars on stormwater infrastructure? How do we deal with sea level rise before it floods our community and makes it unlivable? How do we create a community that's not auto-dependent? And as planners, we have to help them think through that and then create regulations that are actually going to get them there.
And there is this overlap with many of the items we talked about that will make communities more equitable, more access to opportunity, better mobility, will also create greater resiliency. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap with these things. And so we are breaking it down into sections of a zoning code for the rest of the remainder where we're talking about resiliency. Subdivision standards there's a huge opportunity there for resiliency within those, fostering resiliency within those standards, conservation and cluster subdivisions that maintain environmentally sensitive portions of a piece of land and allow denser lots on the areas that do not have environmentally sensitive features. So this is something more and more that is being requested by clients.
Pervious surfaces, lot surface coverage, how much can be impervious versus pervious? What is that right balance? Requiring pervious pavers, things like that. How much can be under roof? So we're seeing more actual going back in time to more FAR requests for FARs. So yeah, but all that stuff are things that we can do in zoning.
So there's a lot, from affecting street design, affecting ways streets are designed so they can be more inclusive of different users, and mandatory street connectivities. And this also bleeds into local finance issue too. Just you know, building streets that are creating connectivity within the community. You know, you're not building a cul-de-sac that maybe has 10 houses on it, but you know, essentially the cost of that versus the number of people living on it, and what sort of benefit it has to the larger community as a sort of no exit street pattern. Maximum block sizes, which can foster walkability. I think it's 200 or 300 lineal feet per block size. Tree preservation within subdivisions. In settings that have more rural land uses, within the subdivision standards, some minimum lot sizes to preserve agricultural land and soils, and doing that strategically through, you know, through studying the topography and the different environmental features, and then encouraging community septic systems. This is something community septic systems have come a long way in their sustainability, and they actually are a fairly sustainable option that can be endorsed within within subdivision standards. I'm gonna take this one.
Yeah, so land protections, hillside protections. A lot of our communities, the one we live in here in Cincinnati, Ohio, we have a lot of hillsides. So hillside protections to make sure that there isn't development that is stripping the hillside of vegetation. Vegetation obviously holds up the hillside, helps to control stormwater runoff. And so when you strip that, clearly that's going to create erosion and stormwater issues. And so there's a demand in a lot of our communities for hillside development. So strong hillside overlay protections in communities to preserve vegetation and limit erosion and stormwater runoff. Obviously, floodplain standards becoming more and more important. A lot of our communities are experiencing 100-year storms now every few years, in some cases every year, which is jarring and concerning. And it's taxing our stormwater infrastructure. It's also creating 100-year places that are in 100-year floodplains are now flooding frequently. And so we're going to have to deal with that. How do we deal with that? Are these places going to be able to be habitable, or are we not going to be able to inhabit them? Cluster subdivisions, Jocelyn mentioned, trying to preserve without sprawling and in a way that's connected. So you're reducing car trips, but also preserving natural, whether it be a forest area or green space or water or wetlands or whatnot. TDR programs are still, I think probably being underutilized because they're complicated and they tend to be seen as, only effective in places where there's great demand. But I think TDR programs can help preserve property rights by at the same time preserving the environment and some of these sensitive areas. And then
and so some of this is sort of we've covered in our last segment, but just utilizing land more efficiently. We work in some communities where maybe the minimum lot size for residential units is 4,000 or 5,000 square feet. Like the example shown in the photo, there's examples of maybe a width of 15 to 20 feet, and so we can think a lot more creatively about the kinds of housing types, the lot sizes, flexibility in lot sizes to build more units. And so just making sure we've got flexibility within our codes for ADUs. Tiny homes, we tend to not use that term. We just think that minimum unit sizes, we've worked in communities where there might be a minimum unit size in a more rural district of 2,200 square feet. So you're already creating a barrier to entry for of affordability for especially given the cost of construction going up. You're creating a lot of barriers for a lot of people. So not necessarily tiny homes, but just removing those minimum standards that are, especially right now, smaller units in a lot of municipalities is going to create a lot of housing, desperately needed housing. So just making sure there are barriers to manufacture homes. And then we're finding in the communities we work that mobile homes are maybe sometimes the only affordable units in the municipality are mobile homes. And so removing barriers to creating mobile homes. Oftentimes there might be one area in the city where they're permitted They tend to be stigmatized. So rethinking that.
Yeah, I really don't like minimum lot size requirements. A lot of places will have a minimum lot size requirement, and maybe, if it's outdated, it could be a quarter acre, which is about 11,000 square feet. So in that case, you are through the minimum lot size dictating the price of the house, essentially, and the size of the house. And because you have to sell a more expensive house on that because you have more infrastructure to deal with, whether it's roads, utilities, more land you're eating up, and so the whole thing becomes more expensive, right? So smaller lot sizes actually will allow for less expensive homes because there are, like I said, less utility costs, less infrastructure costs, generally speaking. There are more economies of scale in those communities, and you can sell those homes at a lower price point in theory. So a lot of those artificial constraints on supply, whether it's maximum dwelling units per acre, or minimum lot sizes, or massive setbacks and things, some of that may be good to create the context you're looking for, but a lot of it creates artificial constraints on supply, and that's going to affect your supply and demand curve, and that's going to affect cost. And so if you're in a community that is experiencing affordability issues, you have to look at some of those things.
And it's also just creating more granularity, more mobility, more walkability. We see a lot of communities that might have 7,000 minimum 7,000 foot lot size with no sidewalks, and it's just not an environment. If there was ever a crisis with oil prices, like, it's just a community that would be very difficult to get around in, because it's just totally built on it. Like, we all know these communities, but and that's where it gets to transit-oriented development. So I think we're seeing more and more that more consciousness of the need to coordinate our transportation expenditure with our land use policies. And I think we're going to see more and more consciousness of that. We're seeing out of the federal government, out of state governments. California just passed, what is it? No parking minimums, your transit act, I think. And so that's just something we can be more and more conscious of, and really promoting TOD within zoning codes.
I really hate that example on there, though. And that's because it's all garage, right? Mm-hmm. And this is part of the problem. So housing, a lot of our housing on small, narrow lots ends up being this garage facing. And really what we want there are porches so people can sit out on their front porch. Now, where do you put the garage is the problem. You can't. Right. Maybe it's in the back, maybe it's a driveway down the side, or it's on-street parking, right? Or it's transit-oriented. But so much is oriented around the automobile. And it is an important part of our life, but we have to start thinking about how we subordinate the automobile to the pedestrian.
Agreed. Yeah. So, and then use standards, use proximity, like Sean said, single use zoning is unnatural. Ensuring that there's different types of uses are in proximity to each other, so you can double up your trips. You can go to do multiple things you have to do in a day in one trip. We're seeing communities as more and more they want mixed use environments because the prospects for getting retail tenants, the prospects for getting office tenants, they're sort of unsure about that. So they want mixed use districts that run the gamut of like light industrial maker spaces to residential, and these are compatible uses. There'll be use standards to ensure they're compatible. So we're seeing this more and more. Things like live work units. So just trying to create that mixed use environment that has been illegal in so many of our cities, which I'm sure with this crowd, this is nothing new. Facilitating the adaptive reuse of buildings, removing those barriers. Some communities have special adaptive reuse permits that just sort of create sort of a different set of standards and flexibility to be able to reuse those buildings. And then historic preservation, there's that, which is more of Sean's area of expertise. The most sustainable building is the building that's already built, that can really go a long way to sort of reducing our consumption of construction materials. As we talked about ADUs, granular infill. And with ADUs, the point is, if permitting them, ensure that I do think that a tailored approach to ADUs that makes them appropriate within the district where they're being permitted, is a good thing, but making sure that the regulations appended to them don't make them too challenging to build, which we see in a lot of communities that get permitted with conditions, and then none of them get built.
Yeah, they're conditioned out of existence. Yeah. The going back on that real quick, go back real quick on that.
Sure.
The adaptive reuse of buildings is a really critical one. We have made it so that nonconformities, the building's non-conforming, and so you can't expand it. Well, why not? A lot of the non-conforming rules were intended to, over time, eliminate certain uses we don't want anymore, certain building forms we don't want anymore. But I think that's fictional. I rarely see it ever happen, and if it does, it takes a lifetime for it to occur. Really, we need to breathe new life and creativity into these buildings. And so creating an adaptive reuse ordinance is a really positive thing, I think. How do we reuse these buildings, allow them to be used for multiple uses? I think single-use buildings need to die forever. Except maybe your home where you don't want someone opening a business in it. And even then, home occupations are a big thing nowadays. But single-use building, a single-purpose building that you have to connect only and access only by the automobile is just antithetical to the way human beings have lived for all of time. So I think those need to go away. And a lot of the uses nowadays are much more compatible. We don't have as many, pollution spewing factories anymore, things like that. So you can actually live near makerspace or in manufacturing areas and do so in a way that is compatible.
Yeah. We do have to move quickly.
Yep.
The remaining slides were a little bit. So the generally applicable section of your code, we talked about eliminating local standards and all the reasons we should do that. But looking at dark sky standards for lighting, I think those standards can provide a lot of guidance in providing lighting that isn't disruptive to ecosystems. Incentivize pervious paving, which you mentioned, Sean, eliminating barriers to solar installations, and also limiting the various ways that HOAs could be putting restrictions on things like solar panels or rain harvesting or composting. There's a range of things. So these are just some generally applicable. I think we talked about a lot of these. Landscaping, you can mandate native species and mandate plant diversity. No more than a certain percentage of your landscaping can be any certain plant genus. Promote pollinators, promote fruit trees, which goes down with our incentivization of urban agriculture. There's so much more content on the internet about incentivizing urban agriculture. So if that's a section of your code that you're redoing, there are a ton of great resources that you can refer to.
A lot of the times the reason people don't like solar is because of the way it looks.
Right.
And so they have ordinances against it. People don't put it on their roof. Or solar in ag areas. A lot of farmers like leasing their property to solar array companies. They make good money on it. It provides a lot of electricity, and they don't have to lease it to a farmer. And maybe the land's worn out, maybe whatever reason. And so a lot of places will prohibit that. I've seen that more and more. So
yeah. And then promoting green roofs, which we know can have a significant effect on heat island, or can mitigate heat island effect. But this is really, I kind of wanted to skip ahead to this because this is a really excellent resource. The gentleman, the executive director of this project, Jonathan Rosenblum, is someone that we've collaborated a little bit with. And it's just an excellent resource, and it's got a range of policy actions you can take, from removing barriers to more proactive things you can do to promote sustainable development in your community. So that's www.sustainablecitycode.org. It's an excellent resource, and I recommend that everyone checks it out. It's interdisciplinary. It's practitioners have contributed to this. So it's very well researched. It's got examples of language. It's got examples of things other cities have done. So again, I can't recommend it enough. So there's also the urban planning law for smart cities, climate smart cities from the UN Habitat is another resource that I found that was helpful. So we need to get to question answer. So we will quickly move through this with some things that we've seen through the pandemic.
A lot of it is things that we all know about, right? So more people working from home, fewer people working in office parks and downtown single-purpose office buildings. All those things are going to have to be addressed. Bicycles have risen in, some in popularity. So, if you're living and working in proximity with one another, maybe bicycles the way to get there. And so accommodating that, walk-up windows, drive-up pickup windows, ghost kitchens, those kind of things are also more popular now than they were. And mandatory drop-off pickup spaces. A lot of this has to do with e-commerce too, and providing for us to engage in commerce differently than we have in the past. Then we can move through this.
So we covered a lot of these, and so I'll cover our long-range plan section. So I think that comprehensive plans can be really a place where we acknowledge some of the harms of the past. Redlining, racial covenants. There's mapping prejudice was a project that was very utilized in the Minneapolis 2040 plan. It was very equity oriented and just like recognizing that these really problematic practices of the past are still very reflected in land use and segregation in cities currently. So using the comprehensive plan as a place of acknowledgement. Again, we don't write comprehensive plans, so we are not experts. We can see that this is just what we see oftentimes. When we're coming in to write the zoning code, the comprehensive plan has generalities like we need more housing diversity, but it does not give more specific recommendations that if that zoning amendment does come to fruition, that you need to be able to look back to the comprehensive plan and say, this is a manifestation of the comprehensive plan. This is an implementation of the comprehensive plan. It's not just something that whoever is rewriting the zoning code has come up with on their own. So really giving legs to zoning amendments through the comp plan. And there's some cities that are doing really, really great work on this front. Charlotte, we found Long Beach Racial Equity Toolkit, Minneapolis 2040, found a racial equity action plan. So those are some good resources to look at with climate change. Also, there's a lot of communities that are doing a lot of really good work to make their plans, really leading with climate and equity concerns. So we are going to wrap this up. We have gone over time.
Yeah, look forward to your questions.
Yes.
Great. Okay, let's get started. So the first question goes way back to the very beginning of the presentation. You were talking about landfills,
Right.
Active or inactive?
Active landfill.
Okay.
Yep, this was in, I wish I knew the name of the community, but it was shocking. I mean, literally they oriented the apartment buildings so you got a view of the active landfill. I've never seen anything quite like it. And this is in the Maryland, Baltimore suburbs.
That's right. Okay. So if there are inherent inequities in the comp plan, how do we make the zoning ordinance equitable without violating what's been written already in the plan?
That's a good question. I think
inherent inequities in the plan. Yeah, there might be,
Yeah.
and there a lot of times are, depending on who's who has the loudest voice in the room, and when they're writing the comp plan, there can absolutely be biases in there that can lead to inequitable outcomes. How do you deal with that? Well, you need to point them out, and as you're writing the zoning code and say, well, at least connect the dots between, okay, you've said this, is this really what you want? Because if we codify this, this is what you're going to get, and make it very clear to the community that that's what they're ordering up and that's what you're going to produce. Now, if it's something that's obviously offensive or whatnot, you wouldn't want to codify that. But
right, I think probably what we see, I'm just thinking about, is we see a lot of like maintenance of character comments, like I talked about before, in a comp plan, which is probably the most problematic and really coded thing that we see. I would say that's where the acknowledgement comes in, because if you have documents, getting that information out there. So these are the things we've done in the past. This is, or even, and if it's hard to find redlining maps, if it's hard to find that information for that community, we all know, we all know, every community has this history, unfortunately. And so, and I think that's where acknowledgement can help. I mean, if it's not in your comprehensive plan, creating resources that do that, because then you can take a step back and say, when we talk about maintaining community character, we talk about the feel of the community staying the same. You can point to that history. I think that, but I mean, I know that that's easier said than done, but I think the acknowledgement is really important.
Your comp plan should focus on areas of change. Now, where are those areas that we see the most opportunity for change? Unless you're talking about historic preservation, which is very important. Generally speaking, if your comp plan is looking at preserving and maintaining the status quo, that may be fine in certain places, but I think there needs to be a focus on the opportunity for change. And so most of the comp plans we see are focused on those areas of opportunity for change, whether that's housing, diversity, or economic opportunity. And that's really where the zoning code changes are going to focus for the most part. But every now and again, we come across comp plans that are focused on we don't want any change. And that makes it challenging. And you end up, and there's not a whole lot you can do with that from a zoning code standpoint, except reconfigure the code, add graphics, and clean up the language. But it's not going to be a huge impact on the zoning regs.
This question is interesting. As professional planners, we put a lot of credence in the fact the zoning must comply with New York State enabling statutes to prevail over any attempts of litigation. So what can municipalities do if well-intentioned zoning changes would be in conflict with state regulations that are simply becoming antiquated?
Yeah, that is challenging. A lot of places we work, we run the gamut from home rule, where the community makes the decisions about local land use issues. That's a matter of local self-governance, to very state statutorily prescribed zoning regulations. And that is a tension in a lot of states between cities and the state legislature. State legislatures tend to be less urban in their makeup than the cities are, and so that's going to come down to having a voice in your state legislature, education, and lobbying. Frankly, whether you have a municipal league or whatever it is, because that's where the battle is going to be. It's going to be at the state legislature in those places, which they can have huge impacts on local decision making. So you're just going to have to work through that and fix and change the law, frankly. You can.
Let's talk about parking for a moment. This question it's good. Metered parking specifically, creating equity issues, whether it's a retail or restaurant employees who have to drive to work, or someone who wants to visit a business or a restaurant. $5 parking can be an unaffordable expense, or even, some metered parking now only accepts credit cards and there's no cash option. So how does this play into, the equity discussion?
Yeah,
it's a great question.
It is, and I use the term like friction to describe this place in time where we want to move, like I think I would love to live without a car. I'm sure there's a lot of other people who would love to. It's just not it's not reality for me. You know, there are places in town where you could live without a car, but they're becoming very, very expensive. So, you know, I think this is the friction point when we want to get to a place where we can live without a car, but we're generally in places that's not really very possible. And that question really gets to the heart of that friction, I think. And I think this is where, you know, communities want to talk to us about parking, and the zoning code can only touch a little piece, and that is off-street parking. And that's where it's tough within a zoning code. And I really think cities need overarching parking plans where they can coordinate public parking spaces with the amount of parking that is needed in businesses, so that businesses aren't the burden of providing off-street parking isn't solely with the businesses and the different buildings. And so maybe to some degree, but I think that's where this feels like a cop-out answer, and it's not. It's just because zoning can't affect everything. And I think the recognition of that is actually empowering, because you know that you have to have a more overarching strategy for that. And so, you know, ideally there is a parking plan that has mapped out that this is how many workers we have in an area, this is how many spaces within our public parking facilities that should accommodate those workers. This is what's going to be accommodated for the visitors. This is what is accommodating the people that live here. And so I know that maybe not be the most helpful answer, but I do think communities really need a parking plan.
Well, what's the point of the parking meter, right? It was to move people along so they didn't sit there in front of the store forever or park their car there forever and make it inconvenient for other people who were coming to shop there. So I think parking meters are probably antiquated in a lot of ways, but you know, they are a source of revenue for the cities, and I think it probably needs to be demand driven, and so that it's free in certain parts of the day or certain times of the day, and then, you know, becomes a cost or an expense at other times of the day. But yeah, I think they're here to stay, but they could be smarter.
Yeah, and this is where the high cost of free parking is an excellent book on that front that you know, looks at demand and supply side of this equation.
So when we're talking about the high cost of free parking, we had a webcast on Wednesday regarding electronic vehicle charging stations and legislation. So let's talk about that for a minute, either anything about it really, whether it's on-street parking or off-site, private, public. What do we need to do? Do we need to bring equity into it? Is it free? Is it not free? How much? When? How? Who? All the things. Tell us what you know. What do we need to consider about electric vehicle charging and zoning and equity?
Yeah, it comes into play. We're going to have to look at how gas stations are treated going forward. My assumption is that those will start changing from fuel to electric. You'll be able to go in and pay a price to charge, because there are different types of chargers, and some are fast and some are slow. So you're going to pay more for the fast ones to get you on your way than you will the slow ones. That's where it's going to be interesting to see the inequity. You know, people are going to pay for fast charges versus those who can't pay are going to have slow charges, which is going to slow them down, right? And so what chargers are the cities and the public going to provide? Are they going to provide the slow ones or the fast ones? And so that to me is the issue. I'm not sure what other zoning issues, other than, you know, having chargers and driveways and things like that, and then screening might be an issue.
I think it touches on like this, because I think we had a meeting with an EV company that's providing the charging infrastructure, and you know, there's going to be like the sort of service center zoning. What does that look like? Are we just going to zone those the way we've zoned service centers essentially now? And then there's also the within existing off-street parking, are we striping and sort of designating those and making sure that those are included in a zoning code? And we've had, I think we had one code where we wrote in some of the designation language for EV parking stations. But I think zoning codes maybe need, when it becomes something that is more widespread and the adoption is maybe a higher level than it is now, that there's going to need to be those designated spaces written within the language of the code. But I admittedly, we are just, I think we met with an EV charging infrastructure company. We're trying to learn, and we're still learning too, admittedly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what strategies do you recommend to reach equity changes in zoning that first prioritize zoning changes for multifamily zoning in higher income neighborhoods, particularly when the political will is challenged by these neighborhoods? So I guess I'm going to turn this into a two-part question and say, number one, is it a good idea to prioritize first zoning changes for multifamily zoning in higher income neighborhoods? Is that a good route to go strategically, particularly when the political will is challenged by these neighborhoods? Is that a good way to go? Or are there other more low-hanging fruits that should be tested out first? And then two, I guess, just to answer the direct question, is what are the strategies to reaching equity changes when you're talking about multifamily zoning, whether it be a higher income neighborhood or a middle income neighborhood or a low income neighborhood, because everyone seems to have trouble with multifamily housing, no matter where it is in your community.
Well, you have to look at what multifamily housing is in the community. The communities I find, I mean, it runs the gamut, but in communities that have really poorly maintained multifamily, that's the perception people are going to have of multifamily. So, convincing people that if we build new, rising tides will lift all boats. Hopefully, that'll provide some competition for some of those, poorly managed and run apartment buildings that are getting away with it now. And so build new, you have better examples, and people hopefully will gravitate towards newer buildings. It may also drive up rents, unfortunately, but there's so many different ways to address it. A lot of it's education. In higher end communities, there are certain areas around their town center, if they have one, that you can start introducing higher density developments. And you can start with 2 families and townhomes and duplexes and things like that. And it's incremental change. It's rare that you see one of those communities welcome a 600 unit, multifamily with parking garages. It happens, but it's not often. So there's education. If there's no political will for it, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. One woman on our equity zoning advisory committee is Heather Worthington, and she was the long range planning director in Minneapolis for the Minneapolis 2040, and then subsequently, I think, shepherded through the changes to single family zoning there. And something that she always talks about is how important it is to get out in front of it and educate. So instead of just waiting until the zoning amendments are on the table, talk about the importance, talk about the history. I think Minneapolis 2040 had it integrated the mapping prejudice. So there was that acknowledgement inherent within the document. You could point to that. And when Sean talks about educating, there's something to point to and say, this has been, this is why this change is coming about. This is why it's important. We're experiencing affordability issues. So she talks a lot about educating everybody, even higher income communities, on these changes and getting out ahead of it. I mean, that might be,
that and data. Data is important.
Yeah. That's what I was going to ask about next.
Yeah.
The data piece.
The data shows that we need 1,000 new residential units. Where do you propose those to go? We cannot build single family homes to address this. That's not going to build. We can't build our way out of this with single family zoning. So we have to introduce multi-unit zoning. Where is that going to go? And that is going to be, I think, something that people are going to have to face and address. and determine in their community where that additional density needs to go. You're not going to, not every community is going to embrace it. They're going to say, not here, period. I don't want it. Too bad. But I think if you present the data and say, your kids don't have anywhere to live here. They can't come back home.
Yeah.
So where are they going to live? You can't age in place here. When the steps become, the stairs and the two-story become too difficult to maintain, where are you going to live? You're going to have to move out of this community you love so much. So let's accommodate these ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and when it comes to housing strategies and distributing much needed units, units that are more affordable, this is also, we don't write comp plans, but if we came in and write a zoning code after a comp plan that discussed we have this shortage of units within our municipality, and this is what the distribution looks like based on I know that we have that housing strategies contain those distribution models. That would help us a lot when coming in and writing the zoning code. I don't write comp plans. I don't know what a lift that is for people that do, but it would definitely help us at our end when we're trying to make the zoning amendments.
I'm going to squeeze it, and I feel like now we need to have like a whole larger webcast on just multifamily housing and the trends right now, and where millennials are going to want to be in 20 years, and where seniors want to be, and those that are looking to stay in the community and age in place. And I feel like this is a whole new webcast that we need to get moving on. I'm going to squeeze one more question in. Thoughts on the impact of short-term rentals on affordable housing? Is there an impact? What is the impact? What should we be thinking about?
Huge impact. Check out that Up for Growth report that just came out. It addresses that. Certainly what it's doing is it's constraining supply, market rate supply, so that's going to drive up prices.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I didn't always feel this way, and I don't, I understand that it's a form of income for people. I don't, relish this, that but I do think it's problematic. It's really problematic.
Well,
we're having whole apartment buildings being rehabbed for the intent of short-term rentals going into them. They include that in the HOA language, the condo association language, that just because that's the intent. So you have whole buildings coming online that are essentially providing no additional units.
Yeah, that's not that at that point. That's not a land use that is allowed, right? It's a transient or hotel type land use, so it has to be treated that way because there are issues that come along with that affect the public health, safety, and welfare. So when one of those is affordability, constraining supply, taking away supply is only going to drive up prices, and those units are offline for living. They're transient units at that point.
Right.
That aren't taxed at the same rate, that aren't creating the jobs that hotels are. So.
Right.
Okay, we got to wrap up. And there's still so many great questions. We'll have to have you all back on the line. So folks, again, just don't forget that we're recording this. I'll have it up on our YouTube channel sometime on Monday. And don't forget to record those CM credits if you need them, your equity credits. And don't forget to visit our website to register for all of our upcoming sessions. And thanks to the Ohio chapter and Sean and Jocelyn at ZoneCo for joining us today to talk about zoning and equity and all this super important stuff. And we'll just keep this conversation going. So thanks to you all for joining us, and everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.